Look at this. This is a clue. This is only one of thousands of clay figurines found all over Europe. And here's the crazy part, they're older than the Roman Empire, ancient Greece, and the dynasties of ancient Egypt. They're older than any written history, which means that they come from a world before this. Before everything we know about ourselves. And some say they could write
the new origin story of European cultures.
So naturally, I got interested. I spent hours at the British Library. I spoke to a scholar, an archaeologist, and a geneticist, and I even hunted down one of these figurines at the British Museum. It blew my mind. The civilization of old Europe.
An earth-based spirituality, like many indigenous peoples all over the world.
Peaceful, matrilineal, egalitarian, but unduly biased utopia that some people would like to believe existed.
I saw the backlash and I was like, no, I can't get into this.
Or can I? Because if this is true, then it means that if we go back enough in our history, if we find the people that made these, we break the pattern. What pattern?
That pattern of invasion and colonization coming from Indo-Europeans, we are absolutely still living in. It's almost like this tide of like war leaders came blazing through Europe all the way west and then kept going. And they kept going to the Americas and they kept going all the way to California. That culture pattern.
Why did our ancestors disappear so suddenly? What happened to them? And did they leave anything behind for us?
Is this real? Can this be real? Like, how did I not know?
So what does it mean to be indigenous? According to different dictionaries, it means that your ancestors were the first people to live in one place for a long time before other people came. And in these groups, people have passed down knowledge of the land, traditions, and beliefs through generations. So can there be an indigenous culture of Europe? To answer that, we need to know this woman, Maria Gimbutas. She was one of the most prolific archaeologists of all time. She presented at hundreds of international conferences, published several books, and hundreds of academic articles. She also led major excavations in Europe. She was a highly respected scientist until she saw something that went against common belief. She was at one of her digs in southeastern Europe when she noticed that the settlements from the Neolithic were not primitive versions of the ones from the Bronze Age. Instead, they were radically different, which meant that something huge had happened.
We must re-examine history and start putting back some parts that we have left out.
So she literally spent the rest of her life studying and deciphering the cultures of Neolithic Europe. But it wasn't pretty. It came at the expense of her reputation. She was nearly completely erased. Check this guy out, her colleague and friend, He was one of her major retractors.
She had a very clear idea, and I'd come to disbelieve those considerably.
But was she wrong? Let's hear her theory first. The story begins 9,000 years ago when Europe was populated by hunter-gatherers. These people had been living in the continent for thousands of years. They had their own culture, their own symbolism, and probably myth. You'll see why later. So, we could say that these people were indigenous to the land. At this time, farmers from Anatolia or modern Turkey moved into Europe. Now, note that unlike hunter-gatherers that moved around to find food, farmers stay in one place to grow their own food. But these guys took a leap of faith and moved into Europe and settled.
Mixing, as far as we can tell, quite peacefully.
This is Sylvia Linsteadt. She's a scholar of ancient history and myth that's dedicated her career to studying the ancient culture of Neolithic Europe. That's a word I'm going to be using a lot. When we speak of human evolution, there's a few moments that are relevant to us today in this video. The Mesolithic is when people were hunter-gatherers but camped near water like river valleys. The Neolithic is when people started settling down and developing agriculture and farming. And the Bronze Age comes when people start using metal tools. And these periods can't be given a fixed time frame across the world because they depend on when these cultural and technological changes happened in each region. So the Neolithic was already flourishing in Anatolia when it hadn't started in Europe. It was the Anatolian farmers that brought it in, and
as these Anatolian farmers were moving from the Mediterranean, from a landscape that was more ancestrally familiar, into deeper forested river valley Europe, they were absolutely meeting with Mesolithic people who had been in Europe since, before the last ice age, and they were exchanging ideas. They were learning about the landscape.
And throughout time, they intermixed. Anatolians moved up to the Danube River, merging with European hunter-gatherers, creating these incredibly sophisticated pockets of civilizations along the way that I will show you, like the Sesklo and the Vinča cultures. Maria Gimbutas called this area of Central Europe, Old Europe. And she believed that this was the heart of a culture that spread all throughout the continent. Now, look at this map. These are some of the most important Neolithic civilizations of Europe. And you see, it wasn't just one, but many. They spanned across space and time. What's fascinating is what they learned by looking at these.
The earliest basis of European civilization is an earth-based spirituality. That people lived like many indigenous peoples all over the world with a sense of venerating the natural world.
If you are of European descent, this is how your ancestors lived. Their villages didn't have defensive positions. They were in places that had good access to water, good soil, and good pastures, which was really good for farming and agriculture. Not so much for war.
The lack of weapons, the lack of fortifications of hill forts, for instance. This shows that people for thousands and thousands of years could have lived in peace without much conflict between each other.
But this is the biggest contrast with today's society.
I describe the social structure of old Europe as matrilineal.
Or in other words, women headed the clans. Mothers and daughters stayed in the family home, owned the property, and it was the young males that left to join other families.
We can see that all female or male were equal and there was no ranking.
They also didn't worship a sky god. Instead, they had these.
She's nature. She's nature itself. Because what our forefathers understood was sacred earth. She is the metaphor of living earth, nothing else.
And they accomplished amazing stuff too.
Old European cultures were long-lived, and that when you have culture systems that last for many hundreds of years, up to 2,000 years, without being disrupted, that allows the possibility for very refined cultural development that does not happen overnight.
The Vinča are, as far as we know, the first to have developed a writing system in the world. The Cucuteni are believed to have had between 10,000 and 46,000 inhabitants, which is a record for the time. These were pretty impressive places and cultures, but there's nothing left today. Everything stops here at around 4,300 BC. So what the hell happened? Well, this happened. Bands of horse-riding, militaristic men from the steppes of Russia came into Europe looking for new land. Just so that you can picture them, this is what the artistic representations of them look like. Fucking terrifying. And worst of all, it didn't just happen once. We have to remember that we're talking about Maria Gimbutas' hypothesis of what happened at the time in Europe. And the words that she used to describe these movements throughout her career ranged from migrations to invasions, which is different. But she always described them as violent turning points that had two different cultures colliding against each other. And just like that, as these militaristic men rode into Europe, the Vinča culture was eliminated. And what was once a region of peaceful agricultural villages began to be ruled from hill forts. Do you remember the huge Cucuteni civilization? That one stood up, but not for long, because the people from the east rushed in 1,000 years later. According to Gimbutas, these warriors didn't just conquer the land, they took over its people, its language, and the way of life, replacing the earth-based traditions with the gods of war and sky. But the worst was yet to come, because in the year 3000, the most infamous, ingenious, and vicious warriors of all, the Yamnaya, changed the fate of Europe forever, marking the end of all Europe. At the time, people thought that Maria Gimbutas' hypothesis was outrageous. First, they didn't think that people from the steppes of Russia came into Europe. Second, they didn't think these migrations were sudden. They thought that they were slow evolutionary movements. And third, they didn't think that the civilizations of old Europe were peaceful or had a goddess-based religion. Now, do you remember Colin Renfrew? I told you that he didn't agree with Gimbutas. What I didn't tell you was that he had a politically powerful position in academia, and he had the power to help or block archaeologists. So with all this, from the 90s, Maria's work, who was this really respected scientist and archaeologist, stopped being studied at universities, and she started to be publicly bullied. Funny plot twist. This is Colin Renfrew 30 years later.
I'm still surprised by the results.
He's talking about a study that was published in 2015 that studied the genetic composition of European people from 8,000 to 3,000 years ago. Yep, exactly the same bracket of time Maria Gimbutas was studying. So what did it say? First, the genetic data showed that there were clear differences between hunter-gatherers, early and middle Neolithic, and late and Bronze Age populations, which means that there were different people altogether. Second is that there were two major migrations. One by farmers from the Near East in the Neolithic, and second, in the Neolithic, of pastoralists from the steppes. So this checks out. Third, it confirms a sudden migration where old Europeans were wiped out. And these pastoralists from the steppes replaced about 75% of the population of Central Europe. That checks out.
Had I been invited to give this lecture 2 or 3 years ago, it would have been a lecture which might have ended up rather critically of Maria's ideas. She ends up as the triumphant precursor of much current work.
I mean, scholars didn't believe her, but she literally saw her on the ground. So point 1, point 2, checked out, confirmed by modern science. Now, I was still thinking about the third, and I was thinking, so these migrations were sudden, but how did they happen? Do we know? Because then that could explain the third point. To find out, I spoke to Kristian Kristiansen. He's a leading expert in the field of the Bronze Age, and I asked him about the mass killings.
So yes, they had the upper hand, you can say, in confrontation. They were warriors, they were stronger, and they were well trained.
But
maybe one of the reasons they were able to move in so successfully was that you had this huge plague pandemic going from Lake Baikal to England, sweeping through Neolithic Europe.
Brought on by other migrations, of course, similar to what happened in America.
It devastated Neolithic societies, and my take on it is that probably up towards half the population died. And we know for certain that all Neolithic males died out.
Most likely in conflict, because
what survived were the female lineages.
So if you're of European descent, your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfathers of 5,000 years ago died in a pandemic brought on by colonialists from the East or murdered by them. And your grandmothers married into a different culture in their own colonized territory. That from then on, the populations of Europe changed.
So it's a totally different dynamic. I would suggest that some of that dynamic is what created a lot of the Europe we know today. Europeans since then have been incredibly expansionist, and you have to ask yourself why.
Old European cultures invented a writing system 6,000 years ago, thousands of years before the Sumerian cuneiform. They built cities bigger than the ones that existed at the time, like those in Mesopotamia, before the Great Pyramids of Egypt. And it all came to a halt when Indo-European pastoralists arrived looking for new territory.
The genetics proved her correct. Hopefully suggests that her overall methodology and scholarship is trustworthy. Because if she was able to read the patterns that well when nobody else was reading them, that means that other patterns we can maybe lean on too. To use it as like a stepping stone, that this is actually a legitimate pathway of inquiry.
But I still had one more question, the biggest question. Do we still hold on to anything from our ancestors, the ones who made these?
We all still know about the stork bringing the baby to your doorstep, right?
Check this out. This figurine is almost 8,000 years old.
We're certainly seeing some kind of bird-headed woman, and probably a water bird with a long neck, so a swan or a goose, or maybe a stork. And I mention those birds particularly because they persist through European mythology and folklore up into, you know, the 1800s, 1900s in Brothers Grimm, in Hans Christian Andersen's. The stork winters in Africa and it migrates up through the Mediterranean and springs and summers and nests in Eastern and Central Europe. And what I like to imagine into is like the vast migrations of water birds in ways that we can't even fathom anymore because their numbers are so dwindled. Particularly the storks and their migration are connected to fertility in a way that we still use as old wives' tale, so to speak, almost, of where does baby come from? The stork brought it. We can't even fathom how many birds would be returning at once, or what that would feel like also if you didn't know where they'd gone.
I love that. You know, it lands well inside of me, and I don't know what that means, but it lands somewhere, and that means something.
It means something really deep. When we think about the fact that particularly women's traditions were passed on orally, primarily, only orally, throughout much of European history, because women weren't even really encouraged or allowed to learn to read or write in so many contexts. The way it feels when you hear something matters, because where else do the memories live anymore?
If you have European descent, let me show you what your DNA looks like. This graph is from that 2015 study that I told you about earlier. And no matter where you come from, you are part steppe warrior that brought in the patriarchy into Europe, but somehow still remembers the stork stories of the early Neolithic people. The people that left us so many clues about how the people of old Europe lived, carved in figurines like this one, which also hides something crazy. Look at the skirt.
This very pattern of the meander shape we can trace back to 18,000 BC to bone carvings that look like both a woman and bird wings. That's Paleolithic, Eastern Europe, Ukraine. We don't really see this pattern on Anatolian figurines. Where we really see it is Eastern Europe.
That's hunter-gatherer, Indigenous European. Somehow, in all of these movements of people, we still have a thread that connects us to our indigenous ancestors. So yeah, we do have expansionist, colonial, and patriarchal genes encoded in our DNA, but also Earth Goddess spirituality, which is deeper, hundreds of thousands of years deeper.
The lower Paleolithic culture, down to 500,000 and more, has produced mother images. All that shows that there was only one earliest religion, the goddess religion.
In my opinion, there is enough for us Europeans to reclaim and start working with to break the old patterns.
We're in a time now of a great dying, brought about by a mythology that justifies exploitation, by a mythology that says that this world is not the sacred place to align with, but that deity is out there, and that the value of a tree is in the cutting. So if we do not rediscover the earth as sacred, we're not going to survive.
Our history isn't just about war and conquest. There was a time where we had a deep connection to the earth, and those belief systems, our indigenous belief system, was passed down through generations in the form of lost figurines, myth, and other symbols and clues. We can rescue what still resonates and work with other indigenous cultures around the world that have been able to keep that wisdom alive while we remember our own roots. Thank you for watching.